So with regards to movement, the foot and ankle are very complex. So they provide multiple axes of movement across the transverse plane, the sagittal plane, and the frontal planes as well. So in other words, no full movement can occur in one direction without there being movement in another plane of movement. So let me just explain. So if we look at the ankle joint, so it looks like if I'm bending it backwards and forwards, it looks like one plane of motion, yeah? Going that way as well. So if I was to draw a line, it might look like a line straight through that middle point here that just goes right across. So if I was to show it from the front, it would look like the axis of rotation goes like this, meaning that the movement is in one plane. But that's not how the ankle works, because if you look at your medial malleoli in comparison to the lateral malleoli, the medial malleoli sits above and in front of the lateral malleoli. So instead of that axis of movement going across like this, it actually goes down and back. So for me to access full dorsiflexion, I'm going to hit a hard point in one plane of movement. Then I have to access eversion to access my maximum dorsiflexion. Yeah. Same with plantar flexion. If I want to go full plantar flexion, I'm going to hit a barrier or a point where I can't access my full range of motion until I add in another plane of movement, which would be inversion, and then I'll get my full movement, if that makes sense. So when we walk or we run, we have a gait cycle, and we have a gait cycle for both walking and running. And the only difference between the two is that during running, you have a phase where both your feet are not in contact with the ground, whereas when you're walking, there's a phase where one of your feet are always in contact with the ground. The normal gait pattern, if you watch most people, will follow this pattern. So the first thing you see is a heel strike in dorsiflexion, with the dorsiflexors acting eccentrically to stop the forefoot slapping down into the ground. The number two is the transition to the flat foot and slight dorsiflexion, now concentrically with knee over toe. And then the third transition, the third phase, is a transition to propulsion or toe off into plantar flexion. So in this position, we have something called the windlass phenomena. So as the toe extends, it acts as a lever and pulls hard on the plantar fascia, which causes increased rigidity at the arch and raises your arch. And then number four is knee flexion to allow the swing phase. There's existed a theory that there's a mechanism called the mid-tarsal joint locking and unlocking system. So mid-tarsals. So the theory says that as your heel hits the ground, then your MT joint will unlock. So in there will unlock to allow for an increased flexibility or an ability for your foot to adapt to the shape of the ground, so that as you're hitting flat down, then it will be able to move about. So once the foot has allowed for this flexibility and you're about to transition into walking to prepare to push off, so to go on the toe off, then the theory states that the mid-tarsal joint will lock to provide a rigid surface so that the propulsion force is efficiently transmitted and not lost. So in that heel strike, these bones in here, all those in there, they're nice and loose to allow your foot to adapt to the ground. And just as you're about to toe off, to walk off, these become really rigid and they don't allow any movement. So that's the theory. So now, as far as I know, there hasn't been enough strong studies that either disprove or agree with the theory. But I do believe many foot specialists are beginning to move away from the theory despite still being taught at universities. So what I think, based on what I know of the foot, I think there's many different movements and mechanisms that happen at the foot based on the position of your foot during any given activity. And the biomechanics of the joints can be different with every single step to allow for movement and stability. So the reality is that the ability for your foot to flatten during activity is very important, as opposed to what you're constantly told, that you have to maintain an arch in your foot at all times. So you don't need to maintain one static position. Your foot needs to be able to be flat, to be arched, to be neutral at the right times and situation to allow for proper and efficient function. So whether or not a locking and unlocking mechanism exists is secondary, as long as your feet are capable of managing the load and forces transmitted through them every single day. That's what I think.